It's just gone 6:30. You're live on News at Prime. Let's take a look at your headlines tonight. The family of a 28-year-old suspect who's been charged with the murder and rape of Limpopo student Precious Mohlahlana says they'll never support him in court. Network operators have been given just 2 months to reduce data prices or face prosecution. The Data Services Market Inquiry has found that costs are too high, especially disadvantaging the poor. And coming up in your sport, Zolani Dede returns home after losing his WBO bantamweight title in a fight that lasted just 3 rounds. And of course, we continue our discussion then in studio with James Hodge of the Competition Commission. This as a result of the report that they've released today, finding, or rather announcing their recommendations and their findings into the cost of data in South Africa. James, let's talk about ICASA and Spectrum, because that's the one thing that we would need if competition were to be increased. ICASA itself has been dragging its feet when it comes to policy and even the release of that spectrum. I wonder now, does this give you as the Competition Commission room to push that process further?
Well, actually, the preliminary report identified the issue of the spectrum and the fact that the process had almost ceased or stopped in the lead up to the election. So the preliminary report called for the urgent release of spectrum, and following that call on the preliminary report, the Ministry of Communications and Digital Technologies put out a policy directive for ICASA. We, in fact, engaged ICASA quite extensively on that policy directive, spectrum policy. So ICASA then did release an information memorandum, I think about a month ago, to start the process. So that is now started. I think the comments on that information memorandum are due at the end of January, and the anticipation is that spectrum could be released by mid next year.
Sure. James, of course, as we're speaking, landing in our inbox has been a statement then from Vodacom. They're responding to today's report. On the issue of spectrum, I just want to highlight one thing that they're saying in this press statement, and they feel that the Competition Commission has downplayed the role of spectrum in reducing data prices. And in fact, they feel that ICASA has given much more weight to that issue in its own report than you have.
Well, I find that interesting because we have engaged Vodacom, in fact, on what are the additional network and operational costs that they've incurred as a result of a lack of spectrum. And to be frank, the results show it's less than 5% over the last sort of 7-year period. So it is an issue, and we were right to call that issue at the preliminary report stage. But I think it's also a fallacy to say spectrum is everything. Competition is ineffective in this market, and as a result, prices are kept high from a lack of competition rather than, in fact, purely spectrum. So I think it's just a matter of emphasis that spectrum is not everything, it's not the answer.
Vodacom is also saying in the statement that they've effectively reduced the price of data by 50% since March 2016. Is that true?
Well, these are all mixed messages. So it's who is getting that reduction in price. And what is interesting from the analysis that the Competition Inquiry did was to find, in fact, that they've been more willing to respond to the heavy data user who's sitting on a contract than to the prepaid 30-day bundle. So to give you an example, quite recently, Vodacom reduced the price of a 20 gigabit per month package with 20 gigabits of free nighttime data down to 200 Rand in response to Telkom's heavy data usage. So that's 10 Rand a gigabit. But the rest of us are paying, until recently on Vodacom, up to 150 Rand a gigabit. So very different pricing to very different groups. And that is why the analysis has identified that, in fact, the pricing structures are anti-poor. And in fact, where wealthier people who have alternatives through Wi-Fi at home, Wi-Fi at work, they're more willing to give those consumers lower prices.
How long is it going to take? Because just judging by the tone of the statement, they are mostly refuting the bulk of the findings that have, the conclusions that the report has come to. So realistically, many South Africans would want to know, when can they expect to be paying less for data? That's all it comes down to. So when you sit and you contemplate even the potential legal battles, the negotiations that still need to take place, how much time yet before we see the full result of what the Competition Commission wants to do here?
Well, obviously, we would like something sooner rather than later. I think that's what the South African consumer deserves, and I think that's what the South African consumer wants. And so whilst there may be some initial posturing in the press, I think we will all get down around the table and have a firmer discussion around how to take this forward.
Sure. Finally, before I let you go, when we look at then this 2-month period that you've set for the negotiation period between yourselves and the network providers, and in terms of how that is expected to go, are you anticipating that before the end of that process, within this timeline, something will happen? What happens if you are unable to reach agreement? What process kicks in there?
So we are looking at that period to see if we can reach agreement, and it may be ambitious over Christmas period, but we think that certainly consumers can't wait for that, and we need to get working on it. But that would just trigger, as we put in the report, a process that starts the prosecution process. Yeah. And then we are going to enter into that process, and as we indicate into the report, then the gloves are off. So there's a reasonable opportunity to respond to what consumers believe should happen, and what the findings of the report believe will happen. But if it's going to be obstruction, then we'll move forward.
Are there concerns at all that the reduction of these prices would have a direct link to the rate of employment in the sector? So if prices are cut, there could be potential job losses?
I think, in fact, probably the opposite, and the opposite for the economy as a whole. So lower prices also stimulates demand, which means there may be more demand for capacity, and when spectrum coming out and that being available, in fact, it may result in an expansion. But a lot of studies have shown that lower data prices stimulate economic growth, because quite simply people have access to cheaper data to run their business, but it also creates business that use the online platform. And if more customers are online, there's more available for those online platforms and applications. So it could actually, well, I wouldn't say could, it will have a far more beneficial economic effect.
All right, James, let's leave it there for tonight. I'll tell you what, you have your work cut out for you, but many South Africans are going to go to bed being somewhat grateful that the plight for cheaper data services and data provision in the country seems to at least be getting some. Of course, it does sound like it may be some time yet before you feel the full impact on that on your pockets as a consumer. So